Ukraine bombarded with missiles. Peace talks fail to end hostilities and a humanitarian crisis unfolds.
This is the city of Chernihiv, 80 miles north of the capital Kyiv. And this is war. This is a residential area. And here's another. Chernihiv's governor says 2 schools have also been hit. In all, at least 22 people have died here as Russia's invasion enters its second week. Cities across northern Ukraine are being slowly choked by bombing. Kharkiv's metro station is no shelter for this man. Ukraine says Russian targeting is indiscriminate. In the town of Borodyanka, population 12,500, wastelands of destruction.
God forbid, if we are no more, then Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia will be next. Then Moldova, Georgia, Poland, and so on. They will march to the Berlin Wall. Believe me.
It's the same story of destruction in southern Ukraine. Large parts of the port city of Mariupol are being shelled. Russian forces are slowly overwhelming the people here. And resistance, though noble, is futile in the city of Kherson. Conquered by Russian tanks, the first major urban area to fall in this war. But there's no bigger prize than the capital Kyiv. An explosion overnight rocks the railway station. Debris from a Russian cruise missile shot out of the sky. It's unclear how many were injured. By day, the capital is being abandoned. These cars have been dumped outside the railway station as thousands flee. It is pretty much deserted here, a couple of people out for a stroll in the snow, but this is a city that's so much on edge, and all the checkpoints that we've come across. The guards have come up to us, they've wanted to check our papers, wanted to check if we're filming them. There really is a sense of dread and unease here, which is frankly to be expected. And this is why. Not far from Kyiv, a column of heavy Russian armor inches closer to the capital, waiting for Vladimir Putin's order to strike.
Zelensky says he believes the only way this conflict can be resolved is if his Russian counterpart, President Putin, sits down with him. Now, today, there were official delegations from both Ukraine and Russia who met in Belarus, and they discussed some of these demands. They're being called peace talks, but so far they really have failed to deliver anything like peace, although it seems like they have been able to reach some sort of resolution on issues like humanitarian corridors, so allowing residents who are stuck in some of those besieged cities to move to safer ground. They continue to discuss things like a ceasefire, but we can see from the demands on both sides that there is still a huge divide. Of course, Ukraine is calling for Russia to remove its troops from all of its territory, while Russia is asking Ukraine to demilitarize and remain neutral, essentially meaning it couldn't join something like the EU or NATO, aligning itself with the West. And all of this happened as Moscow managed to tighten its grip in some critical cities in the south. Russia is claiming that it is now in control of Kherson, a critical port, while a deputy mayor of Mariupol, another city, a sea hub in the south, says that they're being cut off from food and vital supplies, that it is a very serious situation there. So Invasion goes on and on. You get a new sense for the desperation and urgency for there to be some sort of resolution. Called on the West. He has said this is not a fight just for my country. If Russia takes control, well, where will be next? It will be the entire continent of Europe. He says sanctions are welcomed, but they are not working. And so he says he needs more military support. Of course, we know Ukraine really stands alone when it comes to boots on the ground. They're fighting this on their own while they're getting intelligence assistance, some weapons, some financial aid. They want more. They want things like no-fly zones. They want more from all of those Western leaders. So we can take a listen to what he had to say earlier.
If we don't exist anymore, God forbid, remember our meeting. Next will be Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Moldova, Georgia, Poland. Then they'll be walking until they reach the Berlin Wall.
Далі буде Польща. І так будуть вони йти до Берлінської стіни.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky there, and the number of people fleeing the fighting in Ukraine has now passed the 1 million mark. The majority of those have been heading to Poland, some with harrowing stories of escape from the Russian onslaught. Reporter Sean Rubenstein Dunlop visited a small town near the Ukrainian border, which has become a transit point for refugees into Poland.
I'm going to
of Quad leaders, so that's the US, India, Japan and Australia, to discuss the war in Ukraine and its implications for the Indo-Pacific. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jejets joins us now. Stephen, g'day. So it was a bit of a surprise that this meeting was called, and was Joe Biden himself on this call?
Yes, that's right. So this was a bit of a shock, honestly, because we knew that the Quad was looking for opportunities for leaders to meet, and we know that the leaders are going to meet in Japan in a couple of months. But this came like a bolt out of the blue when the Indian government basically put out a little note saying, oh, by the way, almost casually, the Quad leaders are having a meeting tonight. And instantly speculation ran wild, because this doesn't happen at the drop of a hat. 4 leaders, including the US President, the Prime Ministers of Australia, India and Japan getting together. Why are they doing it? There was no mention in India's statement of Ukraine, but obviously a meeting of such senior leaders called at such short notice, it can only be about one thing, and that is the crisis in Ukraine. And that's what very, very quickly became apparent. This is what it's about.
And interesting that the Indians were the ones who first made it public that this was being held, because there has been some consternation in the West that India hasn't joined the condemnation of Russia that there's been in international forums.
Exactly. This is a real strain on the Quad, because Australia, the US and Japan have all condemned what Russia has done. Not only that, they've also hit Russia with sanctions. In the US and Australia's case, really severe sanctions. India has long historical ties to Russia, though, and it still is dependent on Russia for more than half of its military equipment. And so it's in a really difficult position. It doesn't want to publicly criticise Russia. It's abstained from key votes at the UN condemning Russia, and it certainly has made no move to join sanctions. And this is a cause of concern in Washington, because they're worried about the precedent that the Russian invasion is going to set. And they really need India as a big, powerful regional swing state to come in behind that effort. And so I think that's why this meeting was called. It was called, incidentally, by Joe Biden himself, we're told, not by the Indians. And I think the main point of it was not necessarily to heap pressure on the Indians over Russia, but to try and coordinate on exactly what the Russian invasion means for the region. And unsurprisingly, when you look at the statements that have come out, there's no mention, or there's no direct mention in the joint statement of Russia, but there is a lot of talk about China and the precedent that this invasion sets. And this is what they're saying. They're saying, look, whatever we make of what's been happening in Russia, we don't want to see something similar happening in our region. So, and that's a clear message to China.
Yeah, and so what was the actual product of this meeting?
Well, look, the product, in terms of actual hard announceables, nothing really firm, or only a couple of really small things. Yeah, there's a joint statement. The joint statement says it's bland diplomatic language. They convene to reaffirm their commitment to an open Indo-Pacific in which the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states is respected and countries are free from military, economic and political coercion. Now, that is clearly aimed at China as much as it is Russia. And, for whatever India says publicly about what Russia's doing, its real anxiety is focused on China. And in the end, that's the main game here. The Quad is signalling to China, look, we know what's happening with Russia. We know that you've given a level of tacit support, or at least haven't joined the global effort to push back against this. Don't think you can do something similar in our region, and in particular with Taiwan.
And so do you think that's the best that they were hoping for out of this? They weren't hoping that this meeting would lead to a stronger position from India on Russia?
Look, there's no doubt that America in particular would really like Russia, would really like India to go harder on Russia, and so would Australia. The question is it useful to publicly press them on it when they retain these strong links? I think a lot of that work will be done behind the scenes by America. There's already talk in Congress about actually making it more difficult for India to buy Russian armaments, so they can use sanctions to do that. Some people in Congress are talking about punishing India for its stance. But then other people inside Australia and the US say, look, it's counterproductive to press India. It feels like its back is against the wall. We've got to work on this slowly, and over time, hopefully, it will drift towards the Western position. And even if it never sanctions Russia, Modi will use some real political capital in private with Putin to try and get him to back down.
Now, there would have been people sceptical about the amount of pressure Australia could exert on Russia through the sanctions announcements it's made, but what's happened on that front?
Well, an interesting little snippet this morning. The Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, said that a Russian entity's bank account had been seized. She didn't give a name, and that it was worth some $45 million. So, look, when you look at the super yachts and the rest that are being seized in Europe, when you look at the assets frozen in the United States, this is still relatively small biscuits. But $45 million is not nothing, and it does seem to indicate that there's a level of truth to what the government was saying. No, we're not a massive bolt hole for huge amounts of Russian cash, but there are still some oligarchs and members of parliament who have some fairly substantial assets stashed away in Australia, and we can target them. Now, we don't have any details yet, but it's interesting that this has been made public, and it will be interesting to see if the government publicises other assets that have been seized from Russian oligarchs or the others who've been sanctioned, including members of parliament.
And you mentioned in the start of that answer the assets that have been seized in the US and some in Europe. Can you tell us any more about them apart from the super yachts?
I don't have a full rundown of the total list. I've just seen the things that have been popping up here and there. But we know, for example, that we've seen super yachts taken in Europe. The United States has also pointed to a number of entities whose assets have been frozen. I haven't seen a full list of the exact things that have been seized. It'll be interesting to see exactly what does come out. But obviously, the main exposure is in Europe and the US.
Yeah. OK, Stephen Gedgetz, we'll leave it there.